Well, Jonathan, it's great to have you back with us, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you. Last time we spoke, we were talking about the creation icon, which I've got in front of me here, and I hope to finish most of it end of next week.
Great. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's always wonderful to talk to you, Aid.
great. For those of you who don't know Jonathan, I mean, most of you will, but he's a well-known icon carver and has become very well known the last few years. As a podcaster, particularly on symbolism. He founded the Symbolic World blog. And were you one of the founders of the Orthodox Arts Journal, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, it was really Andrew and I at the outset that started it. And so he
Yeah,
owned it, but we basically started it together. Yeah.
that's
To
right.
2012. That's a long time ago now.
Yeah, it's really brilliant. So all of you are listening, if you haven't seen that, do visit. We've got lots of great stuff there. So Jonathan and I have known each other since 2011. I looked through my emails and I think that's when you first contacted me about icon carving. So yeah.
Yeah, that it's so weird. Yeah, it's hard to so much has happened since then. It's astounding. But yes, I mean, I like I said on my own podcast, Aiden has been such a great help for me. He was one of the first people to kind of criticize my work and to give me a few guiding directions in order, because becoming an icon carver was something that at the time I would say probably didn't really exist. You were the only one that I know of in America or Europe that was doing it. So it was a strange time.
So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about our subject today, which is really based on reading this book by Bissera Pentscheva. Have you read it?
No, I have
Oh,
not
it's
read.
amazing because what's interesting about that, it's called The Sensual Icon, and I encourage everyone to read it. But I'll send you and everyone a link to a shorter article she wrote. But what she says is that from the time of the 9th century until about the beginning of the 11th century, people like John of Damascus, but more Theodore Studite, used the word icon less. Icon means image, of course, and instead used the word typos and sphragism more to describe religious icons. Um, and typos comes from the Greek word typto, which means to strike. So really, typos is an impression left, like a footprint leaves a typos, an imprint. And then sort of in line with this, the most important icons for 2 centuries weren't actually painted icons. They were relief icons,
Yeah.
some carving, but mostly metal. And she talks a lot about that in the book. So it's interesting that now we tend to think of carved icons as sort of lower grade than painting. But in fact, for about 2 centuries, if you look at the list of icons in monasteries, yeah, the most important ones are listed first normally. And they're inevitably relief icons.
Yeah.
And then the painted ones came lower grade. The 11th century, then the painted ones became more important. Well, the top of the list anyway.
Well, yeah, the first icons that we have after the iconoclastic controversy, the ones that are known are the relief icons, the royal ivories that we see in Constantinople, and then obviously the steatite icons that but also like you also mentioned the molded icons like the gold icons or the bronze icons. So I mean it is very, I've actually asked myself why that's the case. My first estimation of that was that it's just because they're more durable and that's why we have them. But maybe like you said, there's a deeper or a more theological reason why these are the icons that appear right after the controversy.
Mm-hmm. So I thought we would dwell on this idea of holy images as typos. And the three things I wanted to ask you about. So I thought the first of them is the fact that um, an imprint is obviously like the thing that makes the print, but a negative. So a footprint is like the foot, but it's a negative. So therefore, this idea of typos emphasizes the fact that an image, holy or image or any image that's typos, is both like but also unlike the original,
Mm-hmm.
because it's an image and negative. Like to make a coin, for example, you have a stamp and the coin ends up, in that case, being the positive. The thing that makes the imprint is a negative. But normally we have a positive, you shove it in something like wax or whatever, and you have your. So that's what I'd like to us to first look at, in the sense that we emphasize a lot these days that an icon is there to bring us into relationship with the saints. So it's like them. And that's of course true. But also, and this applies, I think, to mental constructs, mental icons we have, the way icons are painted or carved, and the way the liturgy operates is to remind us that God is like this, but also he's not like this. This what we call apophatic, of course, compared to cataphatic theology. And so the unnaturalistic elements of iconography are perhaps there in part to say, okay, I'm like St. John, St. Mary, but I'm also unlike St. Mary. Mary herself is actually far superior to this image. And I found this in my own mental constructs that even when God reveals something to me about himself, I can too easily freeze at that level. It's very good, of course, but St. Paul talks about going into his likeness from glory to glory. So I wonder if you'd like to expand on this idea that holy images are both like and unlike, and we need to enjoy it being an image, but also remind ourselves that anything God reveals to us, of course, you're expert in symbolism. We also need to not make an idol of what God has given to us. So could you speak about that?
I think that's the key. I think there are two keys on what you're saying, is that Christianity, one of the aspects of Christianity is the possibility of unity and multiplicity coexisting, right? So in some ways, the reason why we don't believe, for example, that theosis is something like a drop going back into the source, right? We don't have this idea that theosis is the dissolution of the self into the infinite, but rather is the shining of the particular in the, like a kind of refraction of Christ, so this idea that in the kingdom, St. Peter is more St. Peter, St. Paul is more St. Paul, right? They don't stop being themselves, but rather they become like like I said, a refraction of Christ in their particularity. And so I think that is one of the keys, is to understand that Christianity doesn't impose a kind of identity, but rather this multiplicity and a variety on themes and on unity. But that's like the glory. It's the glory of our participation. The glory of creation is that, the image, like you said, even the saint, refracts an aspect of Christ to us and leads us towards Christ, but is not the fullness of Christ. And in the same way, the image of them, or the encounters we can have with them through hymnology or through whatever, they're also a refraction of that person into the world. I think that's an important part, and that's why Christianity doesn't have the same problem with idols as the ancient world did, because Christians never believed that. Well, maybe some did, but they would have been criticized by the councils or by the saints. Like, the idea in the ancient world, at least for some people, was that that's the God, right? You go into the temple, you open the nostrils of the God, you breathe into the God, and there it is. Like, that's the God. And there's a kind of identity with what it's representing. But in Christianity, right away, at least in the council, we have this sense that one of the ways Christ reveals himself is through his image, and that's something to be celebrated and to be acknowledged and participated in. But the image is not the thing, right? It is, like all the saints point to Christ, the images also point to that which they're representing. So that's what I would say, is that in some ways, I think it's this idea of typos, in the sense of being different from the image, is extremely important in understanding how Christianity itself functions, right? What it means to be a Christian.
Westminster Confessor spoke a lot about this, didn't he? That to have unity, you need utter distinction. It's the mistake communism made. It sort of sacrificed individuals for the sake of some ideal unity. But each person has got the value of a million people, that they're fractal, as it were, as you often say. I wondered if a lot of people have rejected Christianity because they have this misconception that holiness makes everyone the same. Now, holiness is following some sort of authority from above that represses your individuality. In reality, of course, I mean, I've known some saints; they're all just so different.
Yeah.
I feel, in comparison, I'm just a sort of an arbitrary mishmash of different people glued together. But these people, St. Paisius, no one like Paisius. Paisius is himself. He's not someone else attached on. So how do you think this caricature of Christianity came about, do you think? That there's some sort of authority above that makes you all the same, that limits your freedom, therefore limits
Yeah.
uniqueness from person to
But I
person.
think there's a kind of perversion that happens in the modern world that is, I call it a de-incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
This de-incarnation tends in two direction. One, on the one hand, you have something like absolute idiosyncrasy, right? You know, the illusion of the rebel and the punk rocker, and the illusion of the transgressive, right? That we have this culture of transgression and of pure individuality. And on the other hand, you have this like bland uniformity where, you know, the suburbs, everything is all the same, and you have houses, cookie cutter houses all next to each other. So I think it is in some ways, in the decline of Christianity, people then embrace these caricatures about what Christianity was, and it can be either one or the other. It can be this, you know, like you could say in a caricatural way, like a kind of, let's say, Catholic you know, uniformity, where it's like there's one law and it comes down and everybody, you know, just follows the one law. And then on the other hand, they kind of caricature of a Protestant idiosyncrasy where you improvise, and improvisation is seen as authenticity, and, you know, expressing myself to God is seen as this true relationship. When I think, in fact, Christianity is a balance between the two. It's more of this synergistic model where, you know, I move into conformity to Christ, but in doing so, the surprise that I find is, like you said, that the qualities that I have end up shining more than before. And so it's both becoming more myself and becoming like Christ at the same time.
I suppose this can be expressed through the difference between individual and person. Person means face, and face is fulfilled in relationship. So Jonathan becomes truly Jonathan in relationship to other people, rather than through egotistical violence, where you trample on people to become your true self.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have gone through the modern art system, and it's really brutal because it's the sort of supreme expression of this individualism, which is not at all. It's actually a death. It's not a
Yeah, but
relationship.
you can see in modern art actually the kind of paradox. It's not even a paradox, the contradiction of modernism, because on the one hand you have this radical individualism where everybody is trying to find their own way of doing things and to express themselves, but then you also have certain movements, you know, that are tyrannical in the way that they impose themselves on the art world. If you think of kind of color field painting, or, you know, really, really hard abstraction that happened in the 70s, like late 60s and early 70s, you know, like Greenberg and all these critics, with the type of tyranny that they imposed on the artist was insane. It had nothing to do with the canons of icons. It was like, all you can do is this very, very you know, very, very narrow frame of possibility for an artist to exist in. And so you see these two excesses in modern art, you know, and then people, I think people are also blinded by that way of thinking. For example, when they look at icons. And so, you know, you sometimes you find people who have this idea of what icons should look like, and they think that it's some kind of canon that's handed down from heaven. And they say, you know, that's not an icon. You know, icons look like this. They're made this way. There's only one way to make icons. When anyone who's spent more than half an hour looking at icons, you know, from the 6th century to the 16th century, let's say, all over the world, will see how much variety there is and how much difference there is. And it doesn't mean that it's chaotic. It's a kind of symphonic discussion, right? That of different places, different times, that all still have a sense of unity. But the idea that making an icon, there's only one way to make an icon, and that this is what it should look like, is ridiculous, even looking at the history of it.
Yeah. Going back to this idea of the image as typos being both like and unlike, in what ways do you think our Orthodox liturgical art helps the individual to surpass limitations of what they already know, to be open to new revelation? In other words, the imagery reminds us that the God is like this, but also supersedes it, that he's unlike. So what way does the liturgical art, as it were, be apophatic
Yeah,
He
I
talks a
think
lot.
that it's there at many levels. For sure, it's there in the more, even before you represent the saint. The idea of using gold, using gold in the halo or using gold in the background. If whether it's using the precious materials, there's something in our, there's a very natural tendency that when you see something that's made of precious materials, you immediately see it as something above you, right? Something that is some kind of elite thing or something very precious that has to be kept, that has to be cared for. And I think that already will differentiate our everyday life of kind of dirty everyday life with this object that is made in a precious way. I think that's definitely one that creates that sense of otherness with the representation. But then, as you hinted at before, I think the very tropes of the icon, the way that the stylization, the way that it tends towards stylization and not towards a kind of romantic or sensual representation of the saint. Also, even though there are multiple ways of doing it, it still creates a sense of difference, because obviously if I look in a mirror, I can catch glimpses of something, once in a while, but it's usually, you see all the, how can I say this? You see all the idiosyncrasies of the body when you see yourself in the mirror.
Yes. Yeah, I think I gave a talk a while ago. I'm showing that God loves to surprise us. Surprised by Joy, of course, it's the title of one of C.S. Lewis's books. And I found that iconography and liturgy is always trying to not knock us off balance, but surprise us, to wake us up. And there are many writers who have been brilliant at this. I think of Chesterton in particular. He will sort of start down a certain track and you think you know where it's going to go. And all of a sudden, you'll sort of turn at 90 degrees. Think, wow, he's seen that tree in a completely different way. I thought he was going to say this, but then, complete turnaround. So I think there's something a bit scandalous about the way icons depict things. The most obvious one of the different forms of perspective.
Yeah.
That our rational brain just can't understand how you can possibly see a table or building from 4 different angles at once, but the icon depicts it like that.
Yeah.
I think there's something about that. Also, all-night vigils I've been to at Mount Athos. I've noticed they say if it's an 8-hour vigil, about 3 in the morning, you just think, I give up. Your brain sort of say, okay, I've got to the edge of the cliff, I'm going to jump off now, and then you find you've got wings and you can fly, So I think there's something about asceticism and the liturgy that sort of, it's not rational, not irrational, but it, as it extends our rational faculty and our faculty to comprehend, but then it goes beyond that. Yeah, makes you realize actually there's noetic faculty.
Yeah.
Have you read massive book? I've only been reading parts of it, but Timothy Petitsas' book, The Ethics of Beauty.
It's a wonderful book. I love that.
Yeah. But what struck me is that the chapter I've been reading talks about 3 different types of knowledge. And that the first is basically mathematical knowledge. We just have 2 variables. So, if you adjust one variable, then according to the formula, you're going to get that result. The second type is where you get really complex things like weather. So what you can do really, because there's so many variables, is to figure out the probability of this happening. But the third one, which is interesting, is relational. It's, I don't know, like human beings like that. There's so many faculties that he talks a lot about Jane Jacobs, a great writer about architecture, and she was saying that most of the profound things in life are actually all to do with the family relationships. And the only way you can understand them is through love. You can't, if you see a bird, a beautiful bird, if you kill it and chop it up and lay the bones out, you're not going to get understanding of that bird, how it operates. You got to understand certain things about the structure of the muscles and the bones, but it's now dead. So that fascinated me, that this noetic way of sees things in their entirety. I suppose it's like falling in love. You know the whole person as a whole. You might before have known what height they were, what age they were, what country they came from, but that's not knowing. And I think the icon, by sort of extending us beyond our rational faculty, which likes to contain things and know about things, but it can sort of exhaust that faculty. So it opens up this noetic eye.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about, with the understanding of symbolism, how it operates on us? Because symbolism it has a certain rational faculty to it, but it sort of shows us things in a different way, doesn't it, than a scientific textbook might.
Well, I think we can use we can use the idea of representation, maybe also even as a way of understanding this notion of what symbolism does. You know, one of the things that you brought up just now, which I think is important to understand, is the purpose of representation. So, you know, when we represent an image, or we represent something in a medium, there's a reason why we do that. And, you know, if I'm painting a flower, I'm painting a flower, and therefore the identity of the thing that I'm representing is already taken for granted as I'm representing it, right? In my field of experience, let's say if I'm walking across a field, you know, my focus is large, and I don't necessarily, you know, I'm not necessarily focusing on the single flower. But once I focus on the flower, and my perception focuses on it, then that thing shines, right? And it kind of pops out from the background. And representation is a way to emphasize that. And so what I'm getting at is any type of representation necessarily focuses on the unity of that being represented. And it's something that in some ways, I think modern, when I say modern, I mean, even from the Renaissance going forward, like more romantic or more naturalistic representations of the body or of the form sometimes try to eschew that, or to pretend like there isn't this sense that when I'm representing something, I'm focusing on its unity. Whereas there's something about the way that icons are made in the simplification of the form and in the kind of stylization that, and even in the composition, right? When I represent a saint, it's like the saint is in the middle, you know, I know that that's who I'm representing. So there's something about the tropes of iconography, with the icon behind that is almost like a bullseye towards the face. Everything about even just in terms of means of representation, are there to focus on this pre-rational recognition, right? Pre-rational recognition of the person. And I think that, you know, when I talk about symbolism, this is also what in some ways I'm pointing to, which is that a symbol is something that shows us the unity, right? That's what it is. It's the bringing of things together so that I can have an insight into their unity. And so in both of those ways, you know, that's now more of the, let's say, it's the difference from the typos now. Now it's more of the idea of the image. You kind of have this tension between the two, which is on the one hand, I'm representing something, so it's not the thing. But what I'm doing in representing it is helping you see it, kind of pointing you towards its unity. That's why it's framed. That's why it's in a square, and it's contained, because
it's like a microcosm, isn't it?
Exactly. That's
how my students, you don't sort of arbitrarily lop an arm off to fit it into the box. That box is actually the cosmos for that saint. So everything must harmonize with the frame. The frame is the symbol of the entirety, the unity. Interesting.
And so I think that icons can help us understand what representation is for, because even though it's a higher version, when we make paintings for decoration, we don't necessarily have this more sacred idea of, you know, of, like, let's say, the person appearing to us as a revelation of God. But I think that that's still what we're doing all the time to some extent when we frame something. You know, it's a smaller version of it. But if I put something in a square, even a picture, even when I take a photo, you know, the photos that if I would take accidentally, right, like I take the phone out of my pocket and I just kind of press those photos are completely uninteresting. They have no interest because they're not containing a little microcosm of attention that I care about and that I want to put into a frame. And so I think that icons are really the highest form of image, not only in a sacred way, but even in terms of art, because they're doing more clearly what art does, right? Which is, on the one hand, creating a microcosm, like an image of something that's separate from the thing, but that helps us see it. Maybe that's a good way of seeing it, of thinking about it. That helps us see the thing we're representing more clearly. Because why else would you represent something?
This leads me to the second thing I wanted to talk with you about. Again, go back to Typos, that I suppose being a sculptor, and I started off in clay and my casting to bronze. So when I see a negative, my first thought is, I want to fill it with something to go back to the positive. Because you've got a negative mold, I want to find out what the positive looks like. So there's something about an image that naturally wants us to meet the prototype. If you show me a photograph of your wife, it makes me think, I want to meet your wife. I don't want to be content just with the image. I think one of the roles of seeing the world symbolically, another perhaps way of saying that is to see the world full of the logoi, the words of God, is that always it leads us to personal relationship. So instead of just seeing a tree or stone, if I perceive that symbolically, I'm actually seeing God through that thing. So everything's personal.
Yeah.
Working in stone, you must find that I'm just in love with stone. For me, stone and rock. I've just finished painting a wooden screen to look like marble for our church. We haven't got the money yet for a stone one. So I studied marble really closely, and it's like walking into a universe. It comes alive. So the stone is like a microcosm of the universe, and that itself is an icon of God's depth and infinite depth. So perhaps you could talk a bit about this, how whether or not we talk of an image as a typos or as an image, a likeness, everything done in the sacred liturgy, everything in liturgical life, always leads us to the person of God, inanimate or animate.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously completely agree, and I think that people can also understand that even at a more basic level, that let's say the idea that the reason why we care for things is always at the scale, let's say the personal scale, and even for someone who wouldn't believe in God, the reason why they find trees beautiful and certain things beautiful is always in relationship to what is meaningful to a man, what's meaningful to a human. And therefore everything, this image that St. Maximus has, and in some ways we gather all of phenomena within ourselves. I think that this is something that is becoming undeniable at this point, even in terms of cognitive science, which is that you cannot have perception of the world which is outside of your care, which is outside of the things that are important to a human and that are cared about by a human. And so even at that level, there's a sense in which everything is a refraction of what a human finds good. And in that refraction is also hidden the logoi, are hidden the sparks of God, because we are the image of God, and the world is gathered into us. And so if we're attentive, we can see the sparkles. We can see all the sparkles of meaning and of purpose and ultimately of divinity in the world around us. And it's that's very comforting, especially in a world that's full of nihilism, that in fact it's the opposite of what we've been told, that many of us have been told, that the universe is a cold place, without love and without care. The reality is quite the opposite, is that you actually can't perceive the universe without that care. There's an aspect of love, even in your perception of categories, that is inevitably there. Even if it's twisted sometimes, and it's perverted because of our sins and because of our passions, at the root, you can't avoid care as part of our experience of everything.
That's interesting. That's particularly what Jane Jacobs spoke about, this third type of science, the science of complex systems. She said you could only understand them through love.
Yeah.
So I've studied science and I love it. For me, it's a revelation, a theophany of God's love for me. So it perplexes me, and I'd like to hear your views on how this has happened. It perplexes me that with all the fantastic breakthroughs in science, why is it that modern secular man tries to use that as an excuse not to believe in God, whereas for us, it makes us love God even more because it's a manifestation of his wisdom. What's gone wrong with the way that modern science has seen things, that instead of seeing it symbolically and as a portal to God's wisdom, they do the opposite?
Well, well, there are two things. One is the problem of pride, which is the illusion that because I can explain the mechanisms of something, I fully master it. And in that mastery, there's a kind of pride of thinking that it annuls its connection to higher realities, right? Because I can give an account for it in terms of predicting its phenomena. I think that that's the first illusion that people encounter in the question of science. The other problem is that, let's say, the scientific method per se is a method of quantification. So it's like basically all it does is it quantifies and measures and then predicts based on those measurements, whether in time or in space. And it can give people the illusion that it contains everything. But when in fact, everything that the scientific method analyzes already has to be given. That is, the identities of the things that we're analyzing are not accessible through science. They have to be received from heaven, you could say. Right? Before I study a flower, I need to know that a flower is something before I study how it functions. And so in order to even frame a scientific experiment, you have to have a prior identity that's already given. And often I think that the power of science makes people blind to that and incapable of seeing the noetic aspect, which is what we're actually talking about, which is that the grasping of the identity of something, right, and the fact that it actually exists in the world is not an analytic function. It is a noetic function. It's a religious experience. But because the power that science offers can make people drunk, on the power that it offers that they fail to see. But for someone who can hold it in both hands, right, who can both have the capacity to see how things are connected in this great chain of being, right, that manifests the transcendent, then science becomes an amazing tool to dive in, right, and to go deeper and deeper into the smaller and smaller parts and see how they're all connected up the chain.
You're saying that the reality is that the complexity, the wholeness is given, and then science can then understand the particulars. Whereas what modern secular science is trying to do, you sort of start with the bits and try to build the organic living, which man can't do. He's trying to do it, of course, with artificial intelligence and that, but it's a perversion, really, isn't it?
It is, and not only is it a perversion, that
It's a lie as well.
They have to come up with a word, and they call it emergence. They say,
Yeah.
"Oh, those are emerging qualities," as if they have any explanation for emerging qualities. Just because you have a word for something doesn't mean you understand it. And so the people really run into a huge wall, which is there is no way to jump from quantity to quality. You can notice it, but you can't account for it. You can't account for the qualities that and when you say that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, there's no way to account for the whole from the parts. It's impossible at every level, from water being H2O all the way to a society or to anything that constitutes a body and has a head which holds it together. The bottom up approach just cannot account for it. And that's why I think we're in a moment now where, some people call it the revenge of Plato, or that there's a need to recognize top-down causality, because without it, we miss out on understanding how the world functions. And so it opens up the door for St. Maximus and people like him who were talking about that, 1,500 years ago or whatever. They were understanding the need for seeing how identities are connected in this vertical manner towards God.
I think because modern secular science has been so successful at predicting, there must be truth in it. So I think there's a danger that, because we really talk about wisdom, aren't we? We're talking about understanding without killing and dissecting and doing post-mortem. On the other hand, modern science, which does really concentrate on those first two, of the three types of sciences I mentioned, reducing variables just to two, which is mathematics. And then we get something much more complex, just working with probabilities. These things have been quite successful in giving us power. And I think that's been the strength, but also the weaknesses, because it does allow us to predict things. We think, well, that's the totality of reality. Science explains everything, or we can at least predict something, the likelihood of something happening. We think, well, that's it, that's the fullness of science, but it doesn't lead to wisdom, doesn't it? And I think it's a real kickback because of this lust for power expressed through science. In the end, we realize it's damaging us. So it couldn't be as right as I thought it was. So I'm hoping that wearing out this idol and the idol biting back at us, if an idol can do that, makes us think there must be another way, a way of wisdom.
Jan Jacobs totally has the right way of thinking about it, which is that for a secular person looking at complex systems is a way to understand the impossibility of pure predictive, like analytic calculation, because as soon as there are agents, right, as soon as there are agents interacting, you cannot completely predict because they act on each other, right? And so a good idea, a good easy way to understand is, of course, markets, right? It's like you cannot predict markets because as soon as you start to predict it, that prediction becomes a variable for the agents in the system to then act on the system. And so complex systems cannot be completely exhausted by measurement and analysis. And that's why I love the idea. It's really bold of her to say they can only be understood through love. It's like, I totally agree, but it's like a lot of people won't understand what that entails. But I do believe that that's the only way to understand, systems in which agents exist, because you can't,
And that's fundamental to quantum mechanics, that actual active measuring affects what you're measuring. You can't be dispassionate, you can't be.
Yeah, there's no such thing.
But the third thing I wanted to explore with you, and again, going back to Bissera Pentscheva, is she has used this wonderful word enardegia, not energy, but enardegia. And this partially explains, going back to our first point, the dominance of shiny icons after iconoclasm. The word enardegia comes from a Greek root, which means shiny. So we could define enardegia of an art object. Often it was also used for rhetoric. A good rhetor would be someone who had enardegia. It means liveliness, someone or something that brings to life what it depicts, what it's describing. So here it's the opposite in a way, what we were saying earlier, that an image is like but also unlike. Here she is saying that good liturgical art embodies, and it doesn't become what it depicts, but it takes on something characteristic of what it depicts. So life with God is living, and of course light is an image of the Holy Spirit. So life with God is full of light, full of dynamism, movement. So she talks a lot about how the use of light in Orthodox churches and the liturgy, which is a dynamic thing. The liturgy means work, and work involves action. So, for example, she had an image of the Archangel Michael in repoussé gold, and she took photographs as candlelight moved around. She was trying to illustrate how these works of art were made for the liturgy and for movement, and they were to sort of embody the saint, in this case Archangel Michael, in a living way. So perhaps you could talk a bit about this, how good sacred art doesn't just in a dispassionate way sort of saying, well, this is Saint Michael over there, but itself tries to incarnate elements of that saint.
Yeah, I think that even before the visual representation, like let's say before the means of representation, in the legends and in all the stories of the icons, you definitely have examples of that nonstop, where the saint is acting through the icon, right? So it's like the icon becomes an extension of the presence of the saint in the world, where the saint is operating miracles through their icons, and or that the icons have a kind of will of their own, right? You see that you were on Marathos for many years, and it's like all these icons are moving around, without hands, it seems, at least in the stories, right? They appear, they come to the monastery, they find them in the water, they wake up in the morning, the icon has moved and is in another monastery and has to be brought back. And there's this sense in which that the icons are an extension of the life of the saint, in the community. That to me is a powerful image of that shining, right? It's like basically just like the relics, or let's say churches that are named after the saints are still present in the world through this kind of extension of reverence that we have towards the saints. So that's a powerful idea. But then also, like you said, in the means of representation, this idea of the mosaic is a good example, right? Where the mosaic also has a liveliness because of the way that the tesserae are placed, so that as the liturgy proceeds and as the different candles are lit and as the things move in the church, the experience of the liturgy is being transformed constantly, and the way the saints appear to us is being transformed constantly. So that definitely seems to have been a something that the artists and the patrons cared about when they were commissioning these medieval pieces.
Yeah. See, I think it's a fallacy when people say, well, icons aren't art, they're something else. Well, they are art. They're more than just art, but they are art in that you use aesthetic means to have a certain effect on people. And we want to create a certain attitude of soul, and attention, and a compunction, etc., etc. And we use the same aesthetic means that a secular artist might, or even an advertising graphic designer might use.
And lighting, like especially as a carver, lighting is key. You can make an image. Sometimes it's happened to me. Seriously, it's happened to me where I've gone into people's houses and they have, let's say, one of my icons there. And I walk in and I'm thinking, the first thing I think is, why did you put it there? It's the worst place for that. It just gets flattened. One time I was in a show of icons, painted icons. And so they hung my carving next to all these icons that were being lit for painting, and it just vanished. It just vanished into the background. And so this is an example of, like you said, how there's a real liveliness to the image, and it has, even the way we perceive it will be different depending on the context.
I got really fascinated with light and the iconographic nature of light, and how careful you've got to be in a church, just like with a home or restaurant. The lighting immediately affects the people who walk into that room. We've got this marvelous, essentially a basilica that our parish is starting to use. So it's an unusual situation where I have a lot of time to actually design and consider what's best for that place. Normally, I'm commissioned to do something. I might spend 3 hours in the church looking at it and then come up with what I think is the best solution. But here I can gestate and see the light in different times of day, different times of year.
Yeah. Well, it seemed, at least I don't know to what extent this is the case in Eastern churches, but I know in the Western churches in the Middle Ages, the movement of light was a crucial aspect to the design of the building. I was in Vézelay last year, and they were explaining how they didn't align the church perfectly east. They actually tilted it slightly so that the way that they positioned the windows at a certain moment around the solstice, I think it's around the solstice, in the middle of the church, going all the way up to the altar, there would be these like stepping stones of light that appear, like a skipping, and then at the solstice in the winter, it was perfectly positioned so that all the capitals were perfectly illumined, exactly framed, and so this idea of using light and the motion of light, a part of the artistic design, I think, is something that is well attested, at least in the West. I'm sure in the East there are similar corollaries to that use of light.
So to recap everything we've discussed, I'm particularly interested in what we as Christians can do to break through some of these caricatures of what the Christian life is about. I've got this idea that we act as we see. So if a culture is acting wrongly, don't react to what they're doing wrong. Think, well, how are they seeing incorrectly? How can we help them to see differently? Then the correct actions will follow. So the secularization of science, for example, or the bizarre directions that modern art has gone. I mean, there are a lot of great modern art, I think. I'm not ditching it all, but um, what are some ways you think we can help to, as it were, help the secular world see in a richer way, and therefore act
Yeah,
differently?
yeah. Well, I do think that liturgy for the secular world, right? I think that liturgy is a great key for people to understand their everyday life, because, you know, in some ways we're in an interesting time now, because let's say even 50 years ago or 60 years ago, there was still some remainders of liturgies that were part of everyday life, right? People celebrated holidays, they had family meals, there was a certain formality to the way that we encountered each other, right? You shake hands, you nod your head. There are certain ways to recognize the value of the other person. A lot of those in the secular West have now been eschewed. Like there's a kind of fall into informality and improvisation that leaves people feeling adrift and leave them feeling alone. Uh, and so, you know, and so I think that we're in an interesting time now where we can now point back to the liturgy in the church and say, you know, all these things that we've lost, they're still alive in the church.
Yeah.
And there's an upstream swimming that we can do, right, to recover those, obviously in our life as Christians, in our prayer life, in the life, participating in the Holy Communion, but then that also has downstream possibilities of understanding, you know, why do we have like what does a feast look like? How do we gather together and eat? What does it mean to encounter each other, right? The way that we understand encountering saints. So it seems to me that the liturgy is one of the keys to the modern morass that we're in, like the problem of fragmentation in society.
Mhm.
I don't know what if you've thought about that.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely that a Catholic friend of mine who specializes in talking about things like ecology and that, she said, if something's going wrong, look at the liturgy, look at how that culture worships, see what it worships. So basically, she's saying, the source of conversion of a culture is starting with the liturgy.
Yeah.
I was watching a podcast, and you were on it. It was this priest talking about a church, which is sort of, and a parish is flourishing. I forget the name of the priest, a tall guy. Um, um, anyway, it's a big flourishing parish, but he emphasized a lot how much effort they
Father
put into
Josiah,
making the church. So,
Father Josiah Trenum in California.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah. How much effort they put into the beauty of the liturgy, and the fruit of it was it drew people. And that's just not an aesthetic thing. People come to look at nice things, but the incarnation of the life of the church in the physicality of the church, the architectural design, the frescoes where the liturgy is performed, is what drew people, and that acts as a leaven to gradually convert, in the fullest sense of that term, the surrounding culture. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what Father Josiah's parish is doing is nothing less than astounding. You know, one of the things that they're also doing to help to connect and to show, it shows you how aesthetic decisions sometimes have corollaries. Like they're not just aesthetic decisions; they're actually, let's say, declarations about worldview.
Yeah.
They're participation in worldview. One of the things that they're doing is they are finding harmonious ways to meld the different tonal traditions. And so when you listen to the singing, it's actually astounding, because it's quite Byzantine. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, that's a Russian tone. And then and they have these different, and they do it in a way that for someone who wouldn't be used to hearing, let's say, Orthodox music, it would completely go over their head. Like it wouldn't catch them because it doesn't call attention to itself. But there's that effort, right? The effort in the aesthetic means to create a kind of synthesis of musical styles that is harmoniously playing off each other, necessarily has to have effects on the parish as a non-ethnic Orthodox church that is trying to be Orthodox in the best way it can in America, in a way that accepts the diversity that is part of the American experience. you know, and so there's a joining of the mission of the parish with the aesthetic choices that they're making. It's very deliberate. It's not accidental at all. And I think it creates that image that liturgy can transform and participate in the transformation of our perception. It can change the way we see things, and it can open up doors that are not available to just argument and rational rational defense, you could say.
I suppose the liturgy done beautifully and with prayer is an encounter, and people want an encounter. They want to meet God. I think in one of your podcasts, you were saying that we have this sort of secular religion. People say, I don't believe in God, but they believe in ghosts because an experience of a ghost is something real, whereas my experience of God isn't real. So therefore, happy to believe in ghosts because I've seen one. Haven't seen God, so it doesn't exist. So people want an encounter, and an encounter can convert people, can't it?
Yeah.
An encounter through beauty.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, for some people, obviously, that some people are more on the rational side, but you know, I think at the basis, most people, they need that, you know, that call, like that feeling of that call into relationship that you're mentioning.
Well, an idea can be beautiful, can't it? I think beauty isn't just aesthetic, visual beauty, is it? You know, you can have an idea and you say, oh, I see it.
Yeah, yeah.
Means you've seen something that's beautifully balanced, a mathematical formula or something like that.
Yeah, and something that explains other things, something that, let's say, gives you more insight into reality. It definitely is akin to the experience of beauty. At least, you know, it's similar to the type of insight that you get, or the type of being seized. Like, you know, when you see something very beautiful, it's some way you're seized by it, right? You're kind of it stops you, right? And I think that insight in general can do that, even if it's not just a visual experience. It can happen in terms of, like you said, like if you hear a beautiful homily that brings things together, you know, like one of the things that I try to do, for example, is I think scripture is very beautiful, you know, and scripture can be brought to, let's say, to people's attention in a way that they can have those types of insights that you have when you or the types of like, it kind of shakes you, right? It shakes you out of your mundane, the sense of the mundane, that everything is just boring and arbitrary. And then all of a sudden you think, no, like this is coming together like a kind of symphonic experience. You know, I think that can happen. I think it can happen in science too. You know, I think it can happen in any field where you have that sense that things are moving harmoniously, right? And that's the experience of beauty.
Yeah. So to conclude then, I think I'm astounded that no seminaries, I might be it Catholic, Anglican, or even Orthodox, have, as part of the training of a priest, anything on the liturgy. They have stuff on music, but nothing on the visual. So if you could work on that in America, I tried to get Simply Demas to consider having a module, even if it's 2 days. But I had a breakthrough the other day. I had a meeting with the largest Catholic seminary, Oscott, in a beautiful manor that was given to them in the 19th century. And they've now started a module just on the aesthetics of liturgy. So I'll be giving 2 talks.
So there you go. All of you seminaries that are watching, St. Tikhon, St. Vlad, you know, Holy Cross in America, listen to what Aidan's saying. He's saying he can get the Catholics to talk about the beauty of the liturgical experience, and that the importance of architecture and of you know, and of images, and how these are not arbitrary. You know, we need that. We definitely need that. Orthodoxy has so much to offer, and so we need our priests to have at least a sense of how this is part of the Orthodox life. Yeah.
So there you are. You've got Andrew, you've got Jonathan there in America. You've got all the people you need in America to do it. Well, Jonathan, it's been a joy having time with you. We could go on for a long time, but God willing, we'll meet again in the flesh sometime. It's great having Zoom, but nothing like the real thing. But
yes, I hope so.
have you any plans to come to the UK next?
Yes, I will be there in February, and
Okay.
so, you know, maybe we can plan in advance, and
yeah, that'd be great.
It would be wonderful to meet. So
yeah, I'm really sorry I couldn't get down to the big art conference. I would have gone,
this
but
is
I was
it. This is
teaching
the
all
art
that time.
conference in February. So I'm
Right.
going to invite you again. So
yeah, I will
find
keep
the
it.
date. We'll try
I
to
will keep it clear then.
It'd be great if you can come. That'd be
Give me
wonderful.
the dates. All right, then, my friend. God bless.
You.
Bye-bye.